Linda Foster was the most disciplined cadet West Point had ever seen, following every rule with precision that impressed even the most demanding instructors. What they didn't know was that discipline came from surviving 5 years in maximum security prison, where breaking rules meant death. She wasn't training to be a soldier. She was already the most dangerous person on campus. Which city in the world are you watching this video from today? Please subscribe and support us for more stories. At 50 years old, Linda Foster was an anomaly at the United States Military Academy at West Point. While her fellow cadets were typically 18 to 22 years old, fresh from high school or college, Linda moved through the rigorous training program with a level of discipline and focus that bordered on supernatural. Her instructors marveled at her ability to follow orders precisely, maintain perfect military bearing under extreme stress, and demonstrate leadership qualities that seemed to come from years of experience rather than natural talent. Linda's application to West Point had been unusual, but not unprecedented. The Academy occasionally accepted older candidates who had demonstrated exceptional potential for military leadership, and Linda's background appeared to meet those criteria. Her application listed extensive experience in organizational management, crisis leadership, and strategic planning, though the details were vague enough to avoid scrutiny while still being impressive. What made Linda stand out during her 4 years at West Point was not just her age, but her approach to military training. While younger cadets often struggled with the discipline required for academy life, Linda adapted immediately to the regimented schedule, strict rules, and intense pressure that defined the West Point experience. She never complained about the physical demands, never questioned authority, and never made the kinds of mistakes that were common among new cadets. Linda's fellow cadets were initially skeptical about the older woman who had joined their ranks, assuming she was probably a former teacher or corporate manager who had decided to pursue military service as a second career. Some joked that she was likely a retired soccer mom who wanted to prove she could handle military training, but those jokes stopped quickly when they observed her performance during training exercises. What impressed everyone about Linda was her instinctive understanding of hierarchy, discipline, and survival that went far beyond what any civilian career could have taught her. She knew how to assess threats instantly, how to establish dominance without confrontation, and how to navigate complex social dynamics that determined who survived and who failed in high-pressure environments. Linda's tactical knowledge during military exercises demonstrated experience that couldn't be explained by her official background. She understood concepts of territorial control, resource management, and strategic thinking at levels that suggested hands-on experience rather than academic study. Her ability to read people and situations was so advanced that instructors often used her assessments to evaluate other cadets' potential. The truth about Linda Foster's background was far more complex and dangerous than anyone at West Point could have imagined. The discipline and survival skills that made her such an exceptional cadet hadn't been learned in corporate boardrooms or community organizations. They had been developed during 5 years in federal maximum security prison, where she had been serving time for her role as the leader of one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in modern American history. Linda's real name was Linda Castellano, and before her imprisonment, she had been the undisputed head of a criminal empire that controlled drug trafficking, money laundering, and extortion operations across the northeastern United States. Her organization had generated over $1 billion in revenue and had corrupted officials at every level of government, from local police departments to federal agencies. Linda's path to criminal leadership had begun in her early 20s when she inherited control of her family's legitimate construction business after her father's death. The business had existing relationships with labor unions and municipal contracts that provided opportunities for expansion into less legitimate activities. Linda had transformed what started as minor kickback schemes into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that operated like a multinational corporation. The organization that Linda built was notable for its discipline, strategic planning, and systematic approach to criminal activities. Unlike traditional organized crime groups that relied on violence and intimidation, Linda's operation emphasized intelligence gathering, financial manipulation, and corrupting legitimate institutions. Her methods were so sophisticated that law enforcement agencies struggled for years to understand the scope of her activities. Linda's criminal organization operated under a strict code of conduct that emphasized professionalism, loyalty, and strategic thinking. Members who violated organizational rules faced severe consequences, and Linda maintained control through a combination of financial incentives and carefully calculated intimidation. The discipline that had made her successful as a criminal leader was the same discipline that made her exceptional at West Point. The downfall of Linda's criminal empire came through a federal investigation that had taken over a decade to build cases against her organization. The investigation involved multiple agencies and eventually resulted in her arrest on charges including racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, and ordering acts of violence against rivals and witnesses. Her trial was one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in decades. Linda's conviction resulted in a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, but she served only 5 years before being released as part of a plea agreement that required her to provide testimony against other criminal organizations and forfeit assets worth over 500. Her cooperation with federal authorities had helped dismantle criminal networks across multiple states and had led to hundreds of additional arrests. The witness protection program that Linda entered after her release provided her with a new identity, financial support, and relocation to a different part of the country where she could begin rebuilding her life. The program was designed to protect former criminals who had cooperated with law enforcement, but it also required participants to maintain low profiles and avoid activities that might draw attention to their new identities. Linda's decision to apply to West Point violated the terms of her witness protection agreement, which specifically prohibited her from pursuing high-profile careers or positions that would subject her to extensive background checks. However, Linda had become convinced that military service was the only way she could find genuine redemption for her criminal past and contribute positively to society. The application process that Linda used to gain admission to West Point involved sophisticated identity manipulation that drew on skills she had developed during her criminal career. She created false documentation about her background, established fabricated employment history, and provided references from people who didn't actually know her true identity. The deception was thorough enough to pass initial screening, but would not have survived more intensive investigation. Linda's motivation for pursuing military service was partly about redemption and partly about protection. She knew that her cooperation with federal authorities had made her a target for remaining members of criminal organizations she had helped prosecute. Military service provided both physical security and a sense of purpose that could help her build a legitimate life after decades of criminal activity. The training that Linda underwent at West Point was psychologically challenging in ways that went beyond the normal stress of military academy life. She had to maintain her false identity while adapting to an environment that emphasized honor, integrity, and service to country values that were completely contrary to the criminal lifestyle she had previously led. The cognitive dissonance of pretending to be someone she wasn't while genuinely trying to become someone better created enormous internal pressure. Linda's academic performance at West Point was exceptional, partly because of her intelligence and partly because of her desperation to succeed in her new life. She understood that failure at the academy would mean returning to witness protection and living permanently under a false identity with no real purpose or contribution to make to society. Military service represented her only opportunity for genuine redemption. The physical training requirements at West Point were challenging for someone Linda's age, but her prison experience had taught her how to maintain physical fitness and mental toughness under adverse conditions. She approached physical training with the same systematic discipline she had applied to criminal activities, viewing it as another problem to be solved through careful planning and persistent effort. Linda's leadership abilities during cadet training exercises impressed instructors who noted her natural ability to organize complex operations, motivate diverse groups of people, and make strategic decisions under pressure. What they didn't realize was that these skills had been developed while managing criminal organizations that required many of the same capabilities that military leadership demanded. The psychological evaluation that Linda underwent as part of her West Point training revealed personality traits that were consistent with exceptional leadership potential, but also indicated experiences that were unusual for someone with her official background. Military psychologists noted her advanced understanding of risk assessment, conflict resolution, and organizational dynamics, but they attributed these capabilities to natural intelligence rather than criminal experience. Linda's relationships with fellow cadets were carefully managed to maintain her false identity while building the kinds of connections that would be essential for her military career. She had to appear friendly and trustworthy without revealing details about her background that could expose her deception. The social skills she had developed during her criminal career helped her navigate these relationships successfully. The most dangerous period of Linda's time at West Point came during her final year, when routine security clearance investigations for officer commissioning began to reveal inconsistencies in her background documentation. Military investigators started asking questions about employment history, financial records, and personal references that Linda had falsified during her application process. Linda's response to the security clearance investigation required her to provide additional false documentation and create more elaborate explanations for gaps and inconsistencies in her background. She used contacts from her criminal past to create supporting evidence for her false identity, violating her witness protection agreement and risking prosecution for fraud if her deception was discovered. The pressure of maintaining her deception while completing her final year at West Point created enormous stress that affected Linda's performance and health. She began experiencing anxiety, insomnia, and physical symptoms that attracted attention from medical personnel who were concerned about her ability to handle the stress of military service. Linda had to convince medical staff that her symptoms were related to the normal pressures of academy life rather than the extraordinary circumstances of her situation. Linda's graduation from West Point at age 54 was a remarkable achievement that attracted media attention and recognition from military leadership, who praised her as an example of the diverse backgrounds and experiences that enriched military service. The graduation ceremony was attended by family members she had not seen since entering witness protection, relationships she had reconstructed through careful manipulation of her new identity. The commission ceremony that made Linda a second lieutenant in the United States Army represented the culmination of her transformation from criminal leader to military officer, but it also marked the beginning of new challenges related to maintaining her deception in operational military environments. As an officer, she would be subject to ongoing security evaluations and would interact with intelligence personnel who might recognize inconsistencies in her background. Linda's first assignment as a newly commissioned officer was to a logistics unit at Fort Hood, where her organizational and leadership skills quickly earned recognition from superior officers who appreciated her ability to manage complex supply operations and coordinate with civilian contractors. Her performance evaluations noted her exceptional competence and recommended her for accelerated promotion and advanced training opportunities. The irony of Linda's military service was that many of the skills that made her an effective officer had been developed during her criminal career. Her understanding of organizational dynamics, resource management, and strategic planning translated effectively to military operations, though she could never acknowledge the source of her expertise. She was essentially using criminal experience to serve legitimate military objectives. Linda's success as a military officer created new risks as her growing reputation attracted attention from senior military officials who were interested in her background and experiences. Awards and commendations increased her visibility within the military community and made it more likely that someone would eventually recognize her true identity or investigate the inconsistencies in her official background. The investigation that eventually exposed Linda's true identity began when a military intelligence officer conducting routine background checks on personnel with access to classified information noticed patterns in Linda's documentation that were consistent with identity fraud. The investigation revealed the sophisticated deception that Linda had maintained for over 6 years, from her application to West Point through her service as a commissioned officer. Linda's arrest for fraud, perjury, and violation of witness protection agreements occurred during a training exercise at Fort Hood, where military police detained her while she was conducting a logistics briefing for junior officers. The arrest shocked her fellow officers and subordinates, who had known her as a dedicated and competent leader with no apparent connection to criminal activities. The court-martial that followed Linda's arrest was complicated by the unusual circumstances of her case and the fact that her deception had not harmed military operations or compromised national security. Military prosecutors had to balance the seriousness of her fraud against the reality that she had served effectively and had genuinely attempted to rebuild her life through military service. The legal proceedings revealed the full scope of Linda's criminal background and the sophisticated methods she had used to create her false identity and gain admission to West Point. Military officials were forced to acknowledge that their background check procedures had been insufficient to detect the deception of someone with Linda's experience in identity manipulation and document fraud. Linda's defense during her court-martial focused on her genuine desire for redemption and her effective service as a military officer, arguing that her deception had been motivated by a sincere attempt to contribute positively to society rather than any intent to harm military interests. Character witnesses included fellow officers and subordinates who testified about her competence and dedication. The sentence that Linda received reflected both the seriousness of her deception and the mitigating circumstances of her motivation and performance. She was sentenced to military prison, reduction in rank, and dismissal from military service, but the sentence was lighter than it might have been given the nature of her fraud and her criminal background. Linda's case became a study in military justice and background investigation procedures, leading to changes in how the military verified applicant backgrounds and monitored personnel with access to sensitive information. Her deception demonstrated vulnerabilities in military personnel security that could potentially be exploited by hostile intelligence services or criminal organizations. The impact of Linda's case extended beyond military policy to influence discussions about redemption, second chances, and the challenges faced by former criminals who genuinely attempt to rebuild their lives. Her story illustrated both the possibility of genuine transformation and the reality that some deceptions are too significant to be forgiven, regardless of good intentions. Linda's military service, though ultimately invalidated by her deception, had demonstrated that criminal experience could translate into effective leadership and organizational skills when applied to legitimate purposes. Her case raised questions about whether former criminals should be eligible for military service and how society should balance the need for honesty against the possibility of redemption. The aftermath of Linda's exposure and court-martial left her without the protection of witness protection programs or the identity she had built through military service. She faced the challenge of rebuilding her life again, this time without the support systems that had helped her transition from criminal to military officer. Her case became a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of criminal behavior and the difficulty of escaping the past, even when genuinely attempting to change. Linda Foster, formerly Linda Castellano, had succeeded in transforming herself from criminal leader to military officer, but her success had been built on a foundation of deception that ultimately made it unsustainable. Her story illustrated the complexity of redemption and the reality that some transformations require complete honesty about the past, even when that honesty makes the transformation more difficult to achieve. The woman who had graduated from West Point at 50 had proven that age was no barrier to military service and that criminal experience could be transformed into legitimate leadership skills. But she had also demonstrated that redemption requires more than just changing behavior. It requires accepting responsibility for the past and building new identities on foundations of truth rather than deception. Some secrets are too significant to be hidden indefinitely, and some transformations require acknowledging the very experiences that make change necessary. Linda learned that the discipline that had made her successful as both a criminal and a soldier was ultimately insufficient to overcome the deception that had made her transformation possible in the first place.